If you make your graph tall enough and you cherry pick a particular period of time, you can make anything look scary. It's really what they don't show you.
From heat waves to forest fires to sea level rise, what are journalists today often not telling us?
What climate alarmists are trying to do is they're trying to trick you into thinking that an increase in temperature is the same thing as catastrophe.
What should we make of the recent report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? To find out, I sit down with longtime environmental activist Michael Schellenberger. He's the founder and president of the nonprofit Environmental Progress and the author of Apocalypse Never: Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All.
Elites basically in a religious fervor believe that the world is coming to an end, and then they interpret the events around them within that framework.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Michael Schellenberger, such a pleasure to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
Thanks for having me back, Jan.
So, Michael, there's a lot of, let's say, new information, new messaging out there around climate change, around rising temperatures. There was a USA Today article that I was reading, I guess it was, several weeks ago now, that basically talked about NOAA findings that July was basically the hottest month on record and that this, spelled some kind of doom. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, climate change is real. The world is getting warmer. It's gotten about 1 degree Celsius warmer since the pre-industrial period. But on so many other environmental metrics, things are going in the right direction. The period of worst heat waves, for example, was in the 1930s. It has been a hot decade, but the 1930s remained the highest magnitude of heat waves. The chance of dying from an extreme weather event has declined over 99% for the average human being. Deaths from natural disasters overall are 90% down. We produce 25% more food than we need. There's no estimate of running out of food. Sea level rise is something that we've done a very good job adapting to and will continue to do a good job adapting to. Netherlands is a country where many parts of it are 7 meters below sea level. The median estimate for sea level rise by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which just came out with a report, is about 0.5 meter. So what I object to is the painting of humans as sort of fragile or super vulnerable. We're more resilient, we're safer than ever, at least at a physical level, even though we see rising levels of anxiety and depression, particularly young people, probably due to social media. But I think the message that people need to hear that they're not hearing is that the vast majority of environmental trends are going in the right direction, including on climate change.
Well, this is fascinating. Of course, we got a whole bunch of headlines when this new IPCC report came out. And, I immediately thought of you because, there's this report in FT. They show a graph of this, dramatic spike in temperature. There's, I'll quote something here. Humanity stands on the brink of disaster, but with creative thinking and collective will, we may still have time to avert the catastrophe. So this is very, very different language and messaging than what you're suggesting here. Polar opposites, actually.
It really is. The communications from the United Nations have been irresponsible. The slogan that they published the day of the IPCC report's publication was "No one is safe." Well, technically, I guess that's true. We're all going to die at some point, but it's deeply misleading in that we're safer than ever. Nobody disagrees with this. The chances of dying from an extreme weather event are 99% less today than they were in the past. Deaths from natural disasters have declined over 90%. We just look around us. We have a built infrastructure. Go on YouTube and look at what life was like in 1800 or 1900. We were just much more vulnerable to weather events back then. The way that the Financial Times created a scary graphic is just through the magic of graphic arts. If you make your graph tall enough and you cherry pick a particular period of time, you can make anything look scary. It's really what they don't show you. They don't show you the big increases in food surpluses. They don't show the fact that we have these incredible flood management systems. To some extent, there are places in the world like Europe where more people are vulnerable to floods. At the same time, vastly fewer people die of floods because they have really good flood management systems. to the extent to which there's more people experiencing floods in Europe, it's because more people live in areas where floods occur historically, namely on riverbanks. It's not because of a modest amount of more rain. So we see in all these problems, whether it's forest fires or floods or hurricanes, that what humans do on the ground massively outweighs any increase in wind speed or precipitation or air temperatures. Just look at forest fires in California. What determines whether or not you have high intensity fires is whether or not you've managed your forest to reduce the amount of wood fuel that's accumulated on the forest floor over often 100 years. So we see high intensity fires will arrive in a well-managed forest, and then those fires will drop to the ground and become low intensity fires, which are the fires that we want. So forest management outweighs 1 or 2 degrees difference of temperature.
There's a couple of really interesting vantage points here, because I keep seeing, basically extreme weather events and these fires and everything as cited as direct evidence of catastrophic results of man-made climate change.
What climate alarmists are trying to do is they're trying to trick you into thinking that an increase in temperature is the same thing as catastrophe. All else being equal, we'd rather not change the temperature very much on Earth, and that's simply because we've adjusted our farms and our cities and our wildlife refuges to a particular temperature. But if you had to choose, you'd rather it get a little warmer than cooler because many more people die of cold than heat. When it comes to heat, deaths from heat waves have declined between half and 75% in the United States, strictly because of more air conditioning. There have always been places on Earth that were too hot for humans to live. We've actually made much more of the Earth habitable with air conditioning and heating, of course, too. So what we know is that air conditioning is the main event. It might be 1 or 2 degrees hotter for longer parts of the year in some parts of the world, but what will determine whether or not people die is air conditioning. On the issue of safetyism, I just spent a few days recently reading every single New York Times article about heat waves since the beginning of their archives, which I believe was in the mid-1800s. And what was so striking, the 1930s was the worst period by far. The worst heat waves in the United States were in the 1930s. But the media coverage was so different. Reporters were still shocked by the heat waves, but they were shocked because they thought that things were getting better. And this was, by the way, in the middle of the Great Depression. It's shocking, but there was optimism. What we see today is climate pessimism. And it's very depressing, by the way. It's making children depressed and anxious. But climate pessimism is completely unfounded by what's happening in the physical world. In the physical world, there's only the basis for climate optimism. But what you see is that what's happened is really a change in the perception of journalists and other media elites from the 1930s to today, from a point of view, even during the Great Depression, of significant optimism and being surprised by the heat deaths in the 1930s for that reason, as opposed to today where people, elites basically in a religious fervor believe that the world is coming to an end, and then they interpret the events around them within that framework.
Well, okay, so let's talk about the IPCC report a bit. So I haven't dug deeply into it, but even when you read the summary of the report, right, which I think you've said that you feel what they've presented is accurate, right? But it's just the summary suggests some sort of cataclysmic issues that need to be dealt with urgently, at least to me. How can this be so different from if the content is actually in the realm of what you're talking about?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I mean, first, for the most part, the natural science that's reviewed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is accurate. They do a pretty good job of that. All of the vast majority of the distortions and the pessimism comes out in the summary that you described, in the press release, and in the statements by the people that assemble the report. So it's really in the public relations that the distortions are occurring. However, in this most recent report, there was some bad behavior in the actual scenarios they constructed. So about half of the scenarios assume much higher levels of emissions and therefore higher levels of warming in the future than really any mainstream expert believes is possible. And the way that they do this is that they assume that the amount of coal that humans will burn will be 6 times greater than today. Well, nobody thinks that's likely because, as you know, and most people know, natural gas has become much cheaper over the last 10 or 15 years, both due to fracking in the United States particularly, but around the world has been due to the success of offshore gas drilling. We just got really good at gas drilling. And when you hit a good reserve of gas offshore, that gas flowing in is just much easier and cheaper to harvest than coal. And since coal creates twice as much carbon emissions per unit of energy, the switch from coal to gas has been really good for the climate. So what we know is that we're almost certainly going to see temperatures peak between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius increase over pre-industrial levels. Like I said, you'd rather not have any warming or cooling for that matter, but that's much better than the 3 or 4 or even 5 degrees of warming that people had feared. So many of the scenarios of the really scary pictures of the future are based on assumptions around coal use that experts have roundly decided are not going to occur. So that is one area where I think that the IPCC really failed in its mission to provide an accurate view of what the best available science is showing.
Okay, so let's talk about coal a little bit. I mean, I'm aware that China, under the Communist Party, is really ramping up its building of coal-fired plants. So it makes me wonder, right, if China is investing so much in coal and, of course, is sort of somehow not accountable, at least at present, under the Paris Accord and other such efforts, could we not reach these kinds of levels of coal-fired emissions?
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to get a clear picture exactly of what's going on in terms of China's future energy. When you interview people there, I've been there, and I speak to a lot of people that try to understand what's going on. Since it's a planned economy, you have different interest groups that represent coal, who represent nuclear, and represent solar and other renewables. So we know that natural gas has become much more expensive this year since towards the end of the pandemic. That means that there has been more of a switch towards coal in places like China, but China's also doing a lot of nuclear. From an environmental point of view, nuclear is the best because it requires very little natural resource and produces zero air and water pollution. And it's the only way of making electricity whose waste is safely stored, has never hurt anybody, in contrast to solar and coal and wind turbines, which are just dumped into the natural environment or into landfills. My concern about China when it comes to nuclear doesn't have to do with the environment. It has to do with the fact that it is making alliances with our allies to build nuclear power plants. So this is obviously a problem because the truth about nuclear is that it's a dual-use technology. You can use it to make electricity in the most environmentally sustainable way possible, but you can also use the materials to make weapons. And so for that reason, the United States has always made it a priority to work with our allies to build nuclear power plants so that we can be on the ground and be their partners. Well, the United States has allowed China to work with Saudi Arabia, which is a country which I think a lot of us have concerns in terms of its human rights record on, but nonetheless has been the way that the United States has balanced Iran in the Middle East. And so by letting China work with Saudi Arabia to enrich uranium and build nuclear power plants, the United States is undermining our national security interests in a region that we know is extremely volatile, extremely important, particularly now that Afghanistan has fallen into the hands of the Taliban. So my concern is that because of our obsession, our romantic love of renewables in the United States, particularly among progressives, and the fear of nuclear, that we've actually been both falling down on terms of what we need to be doing environmentally with nuclear, and we've also been giving up a national security advantage to our biggest geopolitical rival in the form of China.
You mentioned that the waste of nuclear power has never hurt anybody. I believe that's what you said. Is that actually the case? I mean, I think I can think of a number of examples where I think it has caused harm to people.
Sure. So by nuclear waste, what we're talking about in general is the fuel rods from civilian nuclear power plants. During World War II, when they were making nuclear weapons, there was a lot of messes. Nuclear weapons are a totally different animal. So you've had cleanups of nuclear weapons production in Hanford, Washington, in other parts of the United States around the world, but that's not nuclear power. That's not what we refer to as nuclear waste for the most part. And then in terms of the accidents that we've had, it's not related to the waste. It was just related to the operation of the nuclear power plants. So the handling of nuclear waste from nuclear power plants has really been amazing, and it should be, because it's just the solid fuel rods that have been done being fissioned, where the atoms have been split to give off heat to create the power. They're safely stored on site usually, or moved to a facility. They've never hurt anybody. I don't know how else to say it. They've never even, they could fall over and crush somebody because they're very big and heavy, but that's not even happened as far as I know. The reason nuclear is the safest way to make electricity, according to every major scientific study, is because it doesn't produce air or water pollution. The only byproduct are those fuel rods and a modest amount of low-level waste, which nobody cares about, nobody worries about, because it's the same kind of waste we get from hospitals and other places that have radiological materials. So the reason nuclear is so good for the environment is because of energy density. It produces such an intense amount of energy. This amount of uranium can provide me with all the energy I need for my entire high energy life, as opposed to many train cars of coal, many gallons of petroleum or the equivalent of gasoline or of natural gas. So that's what's so special about nuclear. It's obviously also the thing that makes it such a potent weapon is its concentrated form. But from an environmental point of view, what you want is to concentrate your energy and other forms of production, because that's how you reduce the impacts on the natural world.
I'm going to harp on this a little bit more because in Japan, right, we had the most recent nuclear power accident, right? And I actually think that the fallout, again, to use, I guess, a poor pun here, of that was, I think, a lot of people being less interested in building nuclear. I think there's a correlation there.
Oh, well, for sure, you're right. The 2011 accident in Fukushima, Japan, was scary for people, and it was a big industrial accident. We also know that not enough radiation emitted from that accident to cause cancer, to hurt anybody. Don't take my word for it. You can read the reports on it. I've written extensively on it. I've been to Fukushima twice. I've interviewed all the top scientists. I've read all the main reviewed the literature for my book. It's the kind of accident you would expect from a technology that is still being developed. Nuclear, people think it's been around for a long time because we don't have very good historical memory, but we've been using coal for 400 years. We've been using oil and gas for over 150 years. Nuclear is very young technology. It's only been around for really 50, 60 years. So you would expect to have some amount of accidents. But you've got to remember that when, Deepwater Horizon, an offshore oil platform, explodes, people die. When natural gas pipelines explode, people die. So what other accident could you have where nobody dies, nobody gets sick, nobody has cancer? Same thing happened with 3 Mile Island in 1979 in the United States. Nobody was sickened or injured from any of the radiation. The worst nuclear accident, the worst nuclear power plant accident in history was Chernobyl. Fewer than 50 people died within the first few years of the accident. And the best available science suggests that only 200 people total over an 80-year period will end up dying from the thyroid cancer that they got. And you have to contrast that to the 6 million people who die prematurely every year from air pollution. One estimate, because nuclear doesn't produce air pollution, one estimate is that nuclear has actually saved 2 million lives simply by preventing the burning of fossil fuels and the air pollution that's associated with it.
And this is actually also pretty a fascinating, way to think about things because, the pollution, you're saying, is the real problem. It's not the increase in temperature.
It's not like you breathe some pollution and die right away, but we do think that 6 million lives a year are shortened, according to the World Health Organization, from breathing air pollution. humans can survive warmer temperatures. I mean, we do so all over the world. If you've ever been to the Middle East, I went to Dubai one time, and I had to be indoors like the entire time. It was just too hot to be outside, and so there's just the safetyism, this painting of humans as fragile and vulnerable to everything that happens in the world is really a psychological disorder. It comes paradoxically from being so safe. We just don't have that much to worry about. I was just at our family reunion in Indiana. My mom grew up on a farm, and they described their childhood in the 1930s and 40s. And it was like people were dying. They got the measles, they got the mumps. People had fingers and hands cut off. Babies died. I mean, it was like mayhem. And I was like, but did you have a happy childhood? Oh, yeah, we had a great childhood. And now everybody's unhappy, even though nobody ever gets hurt or harmed or gets their fingers cut off or gets the measles or mumps. I mean, I think we should take strong action on pandemics like we have with coronavirus, but just look at the exaggeration to so much of it. And I think that's the safetyism, that's the kind of paranoia or neuroticism that we see as one of the byproducts of having been so safe and so successful at protecting our children and ourselves.
When we spoke in the past, we've discussed in this sort of ideological interest in renewable energy, which you take serious issue with. You argue basically that renewables are actually the problem, not the solution.
Well, that's right. So renewables, which refer to solar panels, industrial wind turbines, burning of wood, they require more of the natural world. They require more land, about 300 times more land to produce the same amount of electricity from a solar farm or from an industrial wind farm as from a natural gas or nuclear plant. They have very large impacts on wildlife. Last week, a lawsuit was filed to stop the construction of industrial wind farms off the coast of the East Coast, because they would threaten the existence of the most endangered whale species in the world, which is the North Atlantic right whale. It's critically endangered. There's only 400 of them left. There's fewer than 200 breeding females. The science is very strong, showing that anything that could hurt or harm or kill a right whale could imperil the entire species. It could go extinct. It's the most endangered whale species, and here they are. They want to build these gigantic industrial wind farms off the East Coast with boats that could kill the whales, with the special wiring and cabling that could endanger the whale species. Similarly, in California, we saw that dozens of endangered desert tortoises were killed after they were relocated from a big solar farm, in Nevada, actually, in the Mojave, Nevada. Big article in the Las Vegas paper. And now we're seeing that in California, the governor, who may very well be recalled next month, has been trying to shut down our last nuclear power plant, even though it has become habitat. I'm not kidding you, for sea lions, seals. When you visit the nuclear power plant, Diablo Canyon on the central coast of California, you can see all these animals clustered around the plant because it's clean, fresh water. It's slightly warmer water. Well, the governor wants to shut down that nuclear power plant, which provides electricity for 3 million people, even though we're at risk of blackouts for 2.5 million people. The governor has just announced emergency orders to allow the burning of diesel fuel, which is our dirtiest fuel. So one of the issues in the recall now is this issue of energy. We've seen all of the opponents of the governor advocating continuing to operate Diablo Canyon nuclear plant, and the governor really in a kind of ideology of harmonizing with the natural world and a kind of fear of nuclear continuing to try to shut down the plant.